To ask the questions. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this presentation. We've attended the sunflower presentation, but thank you for following the Sistema Chakras projects. To give you a background about late corn, well, it's part of the Sistema Chakras. I am the general coordinator of the corn network, and this is the outcome of the farmers' needs. We wanted to provide specific answers through technology and sustainable tools. And we have two things: learning by producing, and we have this thematic network. The corn network is included and is made up of three key components: farmers and consultants that provide the scenarios for the trials, the companies that provide the technology, knowledge, and resources to put them at the trial plots, and experts, subject matter experts, in this case Santiago, who is responsible for the technical coordination and to promote the information in different seminars and spaces. He is the technical coordinator of the network, and he is the professor of agrarian sciences at the University of Rosario and CONICET researcher. Santiago, the floor is yours. Good afternoon. Thank you for staying until the last presentation of today, and bear with me. The idea is to share with you the outcomes of the network, that we have some trials to different nitrogen sources and trials of fungicides. And the question was, how do we bridge the gap? When we talk about gaps, this is the background. Probably you're familiar with this background, but we are talking about different levels of yields for a specific location, for example, a specific year, a specific parcel. The potential yield is the maximum achievable. It's not limited by water or nutrients. So based on the management, we can introduce water and nutrients. Probably that is not a very profitable method. And the potential yield or the growth rate of the crop for achieving that yield would be determined by the levels of radiation, temperature, CO2 concentration, and these three management practices that have to do with genotype, sowing density, and sowing or planting date. But when we talk about potential yields and we say that water is not a limiting factor, what happens in late corn planting in the central area or expanded area? The production usually takes place in the soil, can limit water storage, and the potential yield as a result of that is unlikely. So the reference that we use is the soil conditions or the rain-fed soil. And then we talk about the achievable yield that is limited by nutrition. There were very good presentations about nutrition. Walter, Javier, they talk about late corn and nitrogen, and said that we are not fertilizing extensively corn, and the corn is deteriorated if we don't use what the crop actually needs. So this yield level is impacted by nutrition and the other things that we mentioned before. and then the actual yield that is achieved in the parcel when we harvest the crop. And the limiting factors can be biotic adversities, weeds, diseases, pests that define the level of this yield. So when we talk about gaps, what are we talking about? Well, we are talking about the difference between the potential yield in rain-fed soil and the actual yield in the parcel. There were some estimates published about the gap in late corn for this region, which has a core and an expanded area, and it varies. On average, is 47%, between 38 to 52%. So this, with the management, we can still optimize the yield and reduce the gap. One of the things that we can do is bridging the gap with nutrition or fungicides, if we talk about biotic problems. Another option is to keep the gap, but increasing the potential, because the potential is subject to the crop and the genotype. Genotype is selection. If I choose the genotype correctly, that has an impact on the yield, as long as we follow the same management. So this is the conceptual framework, and we seek three objectives. First, the productive performance of different hybrids. When we talk about late corn and the impact of a hybrid on that potential yield. The achievable yield, which is to assess the response to nitrogen application, and also to determine if we can reduce or eventually increase the yield gap. And finally, when we talk about the actual yield, to assess the response to fungicides using different hybrids that were used in the network, and to what extent this will help us reduce the gap or not. So these are the different trials. We planted 21 sites. The green ones are the ones that have already been harvested. Yellow are planted but not yet harvested. Well, actually, they have already been harvested. They will be part of the final report. And red were the ones that were discontinued. And then you will see why. And each site included 12 hybrids from 21 different companies, different companies. What's important about the network is that we use 200 strips in each parcel with 10 or 12 furrows, depending on the farmer. So this shows the actual management in the different areas. This is a summary of the predecessors, or the previous crops. 1/3 soybean, then service crops and peanuts. As to the date, we are talking about late dates. It's 1 month variance between 26 November to 26 December, shorter than in other periods. Last year, they went all up to 10 of January, and the density were approximately 4 to 6.3 plants per square meter. Well, the specific information about each site is in the report. With regard to water, each bar shows the total amount of water in a specific location, usable water up to the planting, and the rainfall level in light blue. So we had more than 300 millimeters in each location, even up to 1,000 in Monte de Oca, and 30 to 100% of usable water. That means that they had approximately 50% of usable water. As to nitrogen, more or less the same. Dark orange is nitrogen in soil at the time of planting, and lighter orange applied nitrogen. The lowest level are reported at Jovita and Peguajó with more than 300 kilos. So, for this year's season, we can see the yield variance throughout the years in the network. This is for late corn, and each square shows the different locations and the different sites per location. The red line is the average yield, which is approximately 8,100 kilos. 2023 was an average year and better than 2022, which was a very dry year where the yields resulted in a shortage of water, and that is something unusual in late corn. And in 2023 was similar to average years, 8,100 kilos compared to the historical average, which is 8,140 kilos per hectare. The zoning of the trials, you will see these two colors throughout the presentation. Dark green is in the north and light green in the south. There is a little bit of overlapping, and if we divide the yield variability, because we have the difference between max and minimum yields in the north and in the south. In the north, the yields are similar to the average, a little bit below the average, little variability, and as opposed to the south, we have higher than average yields, but with little variability, as in the previous years. Now, trying to understand what happened.
What defined the yield in each case? First, we looked at the weather. When I talk about the weather, I mean temperature. In terms of water, there were no issues. In the case of temperature, these are at the top. We have 3 sites in the north, at the bottom 3 sites in the south, and we can see the changes in temperature. The maximum temperature in red and the lowest one in blue. You can see the dotted line is 3 degrees centigrade, so where there is a froth. And the dotted line at the top would be 35 degrees temperature. This would be like a heat shock. And we can see that in all areas there were days with very high temperature. You will all remember these peaks, that is this week, these 2 weeks in February when it was so hot. And why do I stress the importance of this high temperature? This is a site where the temperature was above 35 for several days. This is important if we look at the phenology of the crops. We know that in corn there is a critical time when the number of grains is defined, and any stress during that time will reduce the growth rate and therefore the number of grains. And it also defines the weight of the grains, which is defined during the filling. If there is a heat stress during this time, this would impact the yield. We didn't have the phenology, so we had made an estimate. And here, this is a paper written by Ratalino and Otegi, and we see the impact of heat stress during the critical time at the time of filling for 3 hybrids. In the white bar is a control or the Czech situation, and the others are situations of high temperature during the critical times. This is the filling time, and there's a big difference between the white and the red weight bar. Sorry, white and the red bar during the critical time. So yield will decrease if there is heat stress during the critical time. We don't have phenology, but we made an estimate. We did thermal additions, and we estimated when the critical time took place and when the filling time took place, and we related this to the yield. This is the yield related to the days with temperatures above 35 degrees centigrade. So apparently, the heat stress didn't have a negative impact on on the yield. Each point is the average of one side. We have one day with a heat stroke, and the results were similar to those sites where there were 15 days of heat stress or heat stroke. And in some areas there were 10 days of heat strokes, and the yield was better than in other areas when there was no heat stroke. So apparently heat strokes or heat stress don't have an impact on the critical time. When we look at the filling time, apparently there is a positive trend. This is not statistically significant. Generally speaking, those high temperatures didn't have a negative impact, neither during the critical time nor during the filling time. This is because there was enough water at all times. This is the mean versus the available water at planting time versus rainfall versus total water. If we look at all the points, we can see a cloud of dots. If we break them down by region, in the north, apparently the amount of water had an impact on yield. It makes sense. And in the south, water was not a limiting factor or didn't have an influence on the different yields. Here, of course, this is water. In the north, we're talking about water from rainfall. If we look at nitrogen, another element related to growth rates, we didn't find anything, neither considering applied nitrogen or nitrogen that was already present. So this nutrient was not a limiting factor for our trials. And another issue this year was this leaf hopper and the stunting problems. This is a paper by Lina Rosas with the REM staff. There is a poster in the poster section, and they used a protocol to survey the stunting complex, and they applied it to 3 Aapresid networks. One of them, the one working with late corn. Here we have the incidence rates and the severity rates for some sites. There was an incidence of about 100% in some cases. In some other sites, nothing happened. And in between, we have different changes for the same site. There is quite a large variation. This is due to the different hybrids used. This is in the report, Lina. Ask her any questions you may have. And this is interesting, and of course, you can see it easily. The behavior was geographically bound. In the north, you can see the dark green areas at the north, the light green in the south. Apparently, there was more leaf hopper attacks in the north, and this makes sense when we look at severity. Those sites where there was 100% incidence out of the 3 had 100% severity, and it's the 3 sites that had left the trial. That's why they were not the results of these sites were not included in our analysis. Now, when we talk about the comparative analysis of yield, these are the rankings of hybrids for the northern area. These are all the sites in the north. This is the joint yield. In green, the winners. In yellow, those that ranked second. And when we look at all this information, obviously the site of the environment account for most of the differences in yields. And when you look at the hybrids, the hybrid type does not account for the differences. But if you look at each site in its own, here we have the average yield, and here in the third line I have the difference between the yield of the winning genotype and of the genotype that came in last. The impact of the hybrid impact is the difference in the impact of the hybrid ranges between 1,000 and 1,100 kilograms. So the yield relies on the hybrid chosen, and choosing one hybrid over another one may represent 15 or 30% of a yield difference, which is quite a bit. I don't know how carefully you choose the hybrid, but this is clear and robust information. If we look at the south, the same analysis, we have this wider variability between 800 and 5,400 kilograms, depending on the hybrid, and percentage-wise, choosing a hybrid may make a difference of 12 to 56%. If we take away this 56, this will be between 12 and 30%. What has happened in this case? If we look at the information in detail, when in that area there was a wide variation in the lodging, we didn't find it elsewhere, and we looked at it in detail. There was something. 2,4-D was used, and not all the hybrids are tolerant, so the roots were damaged, and in some hybrids there was a lodging of 100%, so it was difficult to harvest them. That's why the yields were so different. Pehuajó was one of the areas with the highest yield anyway. So this is agricultural behavior. So it's important to choose the right hybrid. If we look at breaking or broken grain, the averages were quite low here. If we look at the area where there was more lodging, we can organize a ranking. In some phenotypes there was no cracking, but we don't want to punish anybody. This is the second site with the highest cracking. In this case was Villacañas. So we have to be careful once again, because the ranking of cracking and lodging varies depending on the environment you are talking about. Going back to the first question, is it possible to reduce or change the gap and improve the yield? 10, 12 or 13% of the yield is related to the hybrid you have chosen. So if I was planting the worst hybrid and I choose the best one, yield will increase by almost 30%, depending on the area. So the answer to this question will be yes. And the question that came up was, well, does it depend on the year, on the rain, or will this percentage always be the same one? So how did we answer this question? We considered all the data, historical data from the network dating back to 2011, where there were huge differences in yield, 600 to 15,000 kilograms, and we did the same analysis. For each area per year, we considered the hybrid with the highest and the one with the lowest yield, and we considered this, and we considered both to calculate the mean yield in that area. And when we did this, we saw that choosing one hybrid over another one, well, the yields depend on the environment and the quality of the environment. In this case, we have the average yield of our environment in 1 year. In poor environment, choosing a hybrid has the changes in yield or yields may range between 25 and in very good environments, the difference in yields becomes smaller. It, it goes between 20 and 40 in this case. And here, so in average, according to this analysis, choosing a hybrid represents, or may represent a 20% difference in yield. If we add the data for this season, what happened this year? Most of the dots are here around 20%, 23 in average, and we have this one, 52%. And although there was an issue with the management, the differences among hybrids can be seen more clearly. Now, going back to the second part, talking about nutrition now, the goal was to assess the response to nitrogen, to think of other alternative treatments to nitrogen coming from urea. So we looked at different treatments. Urea with 55 kilograms of nitrogen as urea, or 37 kilograms of nitrogen as urea at planting, plus 25 kilograms of Fronda, a leaf fertilizer in V6. This is how the fertilizer is made up, and this was done in 4 sites, 2 in the northern area, dark green, and 2 in the southern area, light green, and just 1 hybrid per site was tested because of logistics. Going back to the results, here we have the yield related to the treatments for each site, and the bar, the color tells us whether these sites are in the north or in the south. And only in Soldini there was an effect that was statistically significant, where using urea or urea plus this leaf fertilizer, whose goal is to improve the efficiency in the use of nitrogen by using less urea, both had better results than the Czech plot, and when we looked at the other areas, we didn't find significant differences. The differences were not statistically significant. And this might tell us that in some places or some areas and some years, or this year, the farmers in this region managed the scenario quite well, and here maybe they should have added nitrogen to improve the yield and reduce the gap. Is it possible to reduce the gap? The answer is yes and no. Here I have the same, but in terms of kilograms per hectare, if I add nitrogen in urea or urea plus leaf fertilizer. In red we had negative responses, though they were not negative. Anyway, it's still a negative response, quite high. And in some sites, though there were no differences, they were very close to the Czech. And in Soldini we had the best response with urea. The range was minus 700 to 1,100 kilograms, and urea plus leaf for fertilizers, the range was 1,300 to 900, almost 1,000 kilograms. Percentage-wise, if we think of the gap, urea represented between minus 10 and plus 16%, depending on the site, and urea plus fertilizer minus 20 to 13%. So, of course, these early results are not so robust and conclusive, but the goal is, correct me if I'm wrong, the goal is to increase the number of trials in this season, and I know maybe in future seasons, in order to understand this rate properly. Of course, weather conditions are very important. We want to include environmental information to understand why in the same area we may have a good response one year and not the following one, why there is so much variability in responses. Now, talking about the current, or the real yield, and this is related to fungicides. For many years, we have carried out trials in the networks with two treatments, or no treatment and fungicides around V10 with this product, this rate. And this year, we work in 3 areas, but we have information about 2 areas in the south, Martinez de Oz and Pehuajó. And we did this test with 12 hybrids. So we added genotype variability in this case. The first results, when we gathered all the information, we can see that if we compare when we use the product and we don't use it, there are no differences in yield. There are 200 kilos more in the site that did not use the fungicide. If we break them down by locality or by area, we see the same result. There was no response when fungicides were applied. This is important because very often fungicides are prescribed before planting, and we must be careful here. Very often there is a good response, but not always. Last year there were no responses. Neither were there any responses this year, so don't take this as a prescription that cannot, it's not carved in stone, actually. When we look at the complete trial, well, if we break it down by genotype and area, here we have the response to the fungicide, kilograms per hectare, values above 0. It is using the fungicide, has a positive influence on yield, and if it's below the dotted line, well, I have losses. Out of the 12 hybrids, 10 did not respond or had a yield that was lower. There was a negative response, and some hybrids had a positive response. If we look at Pehuajó, 4 hybrids had a positive response, and the remainder had no response or had a negative one. What strikes us here is the variability in Pehuajó as compared to Martinez de Oz. In Martinez de Oz, it went between minus 770 and plus 400 kilograms in average. The red line is the mean, and the dots are the repetitions for each hybrid. In Pehuajó, the range was between minus 1,400 and plus 790 kilograms when fungicides were used. And you can see the relative differences at the bottom.
Obviamente lo que les
It seems that we don't need to use fungicides, but it's not a linear response. Last year, there is a report by the network with different fungicide trials by Jose Madias, 21 combinations of sites per year where we have apply and non-apply trials. We calculate the response for the application of fungicide. 0 means that applied had the same performance as non-applied, and the other one shows that it's better to apply. So the 4 without response, and the rest all positive response. 1,200 kilos on average is 500 kilos. So if the performance is 500 kilos when you buy a fungicide, that is okay. And the line says is the return of the fungicide. And in most cases, you're paying off the application of fungicide. You see, for the past 2 years, we will be below 0. And based on this paper, we performed the same analysis as genotypes, the impact in percentage change of applying a fungicide. And you see the response, 0, and there are very few sites that are below 0. Last year was a very dry year, and we have the results for this year. And as you can see, the response is close to 0 or positive. And if we become more specific in the north, we see a higher response, which makes sense because it is connected to the environmental conditions, temperature, water, and disease probability. In the report, there is also a chapter regarding the impact of the fungicide due to the temperature. So some of the findings or conclusions, I was very fast in my explanation. The season on average was average in terms of yields, similar to the network yield and average. We had many days of high temperatures, even during the most critical times for corn. Despite that, there was no direct and significant impact on yield. And last year, more or less the same. There was even a frost. But these crops had no water limitations, perhaps Villa Cañas, but other than Villa Cañas, all were above 400 millimeters. In the north, the response was positive with regard to total water as compared to the south. This year we had the stunt corn and the problem of, or the issue with stunt corn. And the answer, going back to the question, can we reduce the gap? Well, an option to keep or reduce the gap depending on the genotype. Depending on the genotype response to the fungicide. I didn't show you that information, but what we have observed is by selecting the genotype, we can modify on average 35% the yield of many years, right? If you want to be more conservative, the 20%. If we look at the dotted line at the bottom, if there are some specific conditions, the impact can be higher. But 20% is a lot. And I think it's worthwhile taking this into account when we review the findings of the network. So hybrids average 35%, this year 12 to 52%. The 52 was related to some tolerance issues. And can we reduce the gap without modifying the potential? The answer was yes and no. In certain sites, we might need to adjust the nutrition. In the morning, we heard that it's important to perform soil trials or soil samplings to know the conditions of the soil and if we need to give more nutrient to the crop. We are considering only nitrogen, but not micronutrients, potassium, well, other type of nutrients. Nitrogen is limiting to a certain extent, and then the others are limiting factors. Minus 20 to 16%. This shows that in order to reduce the gap through nutrition, apparently is not a good option. And with regard to fungicides, the response is no. We should not use fungicides to reduce the gap for this year. But other years, the possibility was to reduce the gap through fungicides. And that is minus 5 to 25%. So I can reduce yield by 5% or increasing it up to 25%. So there is no recipe for you to take away from this presentation. And thank you all the companies, all the regional associations that participated in the trials, and thank you for your time.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Santi. No sé si vieron acá que había un QR para mandar preguntas. No lo dijimos al principio, pero pueden enviar preguntas al celu si tienen agendado el número. Ya han llegado de personas que estuvieron en charlas anteriores, así que te voy a dejar descansar un poco y voy a responder yo una que llegó sobre el informe final de los híbridos frente al comportamiento a espiroplasma. Comentarles un poco que fue un protocolo que desde el programa REM pusimos a disposición a todos los que llevaron a cabo ensayos de híbridos, tanto en esta red, también para aclarar, que es la red de maíz tardío en zona centro del país, pero está bueno que redes de maíz tenemos 3 dentro del programa, una en la zona sur de Buenos Aires, esta que está en zona núcleo, y en el NEA también. En las 3 redes se puso a disposición el mismo protocolo de medición, así que lo que mostró Santi recién es un resultado preliminar pre-cosecha, con todos los datos de rendimiento. Lo que vamos a hacer es vincularlo al comportamiento diferencial de híbridos y obviamente brindar el informe final. Aprovecho a invitarlos a que recorran el foyer de la sala central de Volkswagen, donde están todos los pósters para que puedan ver tanto este como otros de espiroplasma, que hay varios. Y bueno, ya cuando hagamos el informe final va a estar esto incluido en el archivo, así que eso se va a publicar. Otra pregunta que llegó es relacionada a la nutrición, si además de nitrógeno probamos otros nutrientes. En la red es una de las más viejas, de las que tenemos más años de información, desde el 2011. Hubo campañas donde se analizaron otros micronutrientes además de nitrógeno. Se utilizaron para datos de maestría y bueno, esa información también está publicada, así que vamos a compartirla en breve también en alguno de los informes como para refrescar. Pero esta campaña no se hizo otro ensayo con un nutriente extra al nitrógeno. Lo que queríamos evaluar más que nada es tener otras alternativas, como decías vos en la charla de la mañana, de más temprano, de Salvagiot y de Nahuel Rusicalvo, de tener otras alternativas a la nutrición más allá de la urea, que bueno, es lo que más se utiliza, ¿no?, a nivel de producción. Nos parecía que bueno, usar y probar bioestimulantes, donde los biológicos hoy en día están muy en uso y en boca de todos, y ver la respuesta a estos productos, nos parecía que estaba interesante incluirlo como para ver una respuesta y también incluirlo en una próxima campaña para juntar más datos y tener más consistencia en estos resultados. Me parece clave como para también dar una respuesta y resultados más robustos, así que ojalá podamos tener esta campaña una segunda exploración. Después otra pregunta que llegó, hay un montón. ¿Todos los ensayos están hechos con testigos a la par? No, con repeticiones. O sea, no tienen testigos a la par, son 2 bloques con 2 repeticiones.
Ay, se cortó, sorry.
Después, si medimos fusariosis,
If do we measure fusariosis or other diseases? Well, we didn't measure for fusariosis. Spiroplasm, there was no incidence of other diseases that had an impact on the yield, at least significantly. Do we measure response to different urea applications? No, there is no protocol for that, at least in the network. And in the previous years, no. And fungicides, which ones did you use and when? Well, you mentioned that during the presentation. Miravis duos, all the hybrids were with and without fungicide in the 2 repeats. I think that we answered all questions. Thank you for bearing with us and staying until the last presentation.